following on really from where we were last week when we were looking in John 20. And you may remember that last week we looked at Jesus appearing to his disciples, and then on the day of the resurrection, and then a week later he appeared to them again, this time with Thomas present, who wasn't there the first time. And of course, poor old Thomas, he's only ever remembered for being the one who doubted Jesus. And we sometimes forget that actually they all doubted that Jesus had risen from the dead. In fact, that was the very reason that they were all in the room together with the doors locked and shut, because they were scared of the authorities and their leader had been taken from them. And despite all of the reports that were coming in, they were still a little unsure. We're a bit unfair to Thomas, really, because, in fact, there was in about the time when Lazarus was raised from the dead in John chapter 11, it was Thomas who said, when it was said that Jesus was going towards Jerusalem, and he saw the danger and said, "Let us go with him, that we may die with him." None of the others were so keen, I don't think. But sadly, we forget that bit and remember that he was the doubter. Now John records another encounter with the risen Lord Jesus Christ. And we're going to pick up the story in John 21, and just want to read verses 1 to 16. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. It happened this way: Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them. And they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. And he called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they had landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with some fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." And Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore, and it was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread, and he gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. And this was now the third time that Jesus had appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. And when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said to Simon, son of John, "Do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." We're going to leave it at that point. Jesus appeared to various groups of his disciples at different times, and I don't know whether we can say for sure these were the only appearances that Jesus had made. Paul writes later on in Corinthians, and he lists there some occasions when Jesus appeared to his disciples and wider group of followers at different times in that post-resurrection period, which are not recorded in any of the Gospels. For example, Paul states that Jesus appeared to 500 of the believers at one time. We don't have a record of that here in the Gospels. When was that? I don't know. So there were other appearances, but John has very specifically outlined a number of these appearances that Jesus made. The first, of course, that we've already spoken of and alluded to before we had our reading was on the very day of his resurrection, when he came and stood among them and he met with them. And they were so unsure about him that Jesus had to show them that he was definitely him, that here are the nail marks, here is the side where the spear went in, and it says that when they realized that it was the Lord, they worshipped him. Now, a week later, Jesus appears again, and this time he has to show these marks to Thomas, because Thomas had doubted. But that was the second appearance. And now, sometime later, we don't know when, but sometime in that 6-week period between the resurrection and the ascension, somewhere here, we have yet another appearance, but this time it's different from the first two. On this occasion, they're no longer in Jerusalem. They're no longer in the upper room. The door is not locked. They're not fearing the Jews. They're now actually in the open because they've now gone north. They've gone back home. They've left Jerusalem and they are now by the lake of, or the Sea of Tiberias as it's called here, the Sea of Galilee, as it might be better known to most of us. And here they are on the water's edge, and I guess it's getting late in the day, and we find that there are at least 7 of the apostles now together. And we have the identity of 5 of them, and of those 5, 3 of them are named. 2 of them are alluded to, and 2 of them we don't know who they are. It's interesting that as the list of those that are present is given, that Peter comes first, no surprise there. Peter is usually first when the disciples are listed. Then Thomas comes. How on earth did he get to be mentioned second? Thomas isn't normally mentioned that high up the list, if he's ever mentioned at all. And yet, of course, John has just spoken about Thomas, hasn't he, just in the previous chapter? Was it that Thomas was on his mind, or was there something more to it? We'll come back to that. Then, of course, there was Nathanael. Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, it tells us. Just in case we were wondering which Nathanael it was, not that there are too many Nathanaels to choose from. But he's clearly identifying who Nathanael is. Cana was a little town, not that far from Nazareth, actually. They were kind of neighbouring, really. It wasn't by the sea, it was inland a little bit. So he wasn't a natural fisherman or anything like that, I would guess. But clearly he had come to live and probably to work in Capernaum. It would make sense. You go where the work is. And my guess is that in Cana there probably wasn't too much work to be had. Capernaum, on the other hand, was a small town by our standards, but it was bustling. It had a market there. It had commerce and trade was taking place there. It would be the kind of place where you would find work. Why were these three mentioned by name? Why is it that when the next two are mentioned, although we know who they are, they're not mentioned by names? The sons of Zebedee. Well, that's James and John, the author of this work. John very seldom ever refers to himself. Normally he refers to himself quite cryptically, often noting that he was the one Jesus loved. And, we might sort of struggle to understand why someone in his position, remembering as he's writing this as a man quite elderly by this stage, coming towards the end of his life and writing these things down many decades later, that wouldn't he have learnt some humility by now? I mean, you don't go around, do you, saying, well, I'm the one Jesus loved, as much as to say, well, he didn't like the others quite as much as he did me. But I don't think it was like that. I think John is being truly honest, but I think that there are reasons that we're not going to go into today for why he might have said that and why he was constantly describing himself in that way. But James and John are not named. And then there were two other disciples. Who were the two other disciples? Well, we can go through a process of deduction here, can't we? In the first place, Jesus had 12 disciples. But then, of course, Judas hung himself. We're down to 11. So we've now got 11 of these disciples. 7 of them are in the boat, leaving 4 left. Of those 4, we know that 2 of these are not named, so there are 6 possibilities as to who it might be. Well, if Peter was there, and James and John are there, you've got to ask yourself the question, who are James and John and Peter's business partner out of all of those apostles, which of course is Andrew, Peter's brother? It seems very unlikely that Andrew would not have been there. We also know that Nathanael was very friendly with Philip. They got on very well together. So we could take a fairly educated guess that probably Philip was present. Also, further than that, it's quite possible that they were all involved in fishing. We don't actually know what Philip and Nathanael did for work. But why on earth did they go to Capernaum? Philip was actually from Bethsaida, just round the corner. So he was brought up by the sea. Quite likely he was into fishing. But what I would say is this. Even bearing in mind that John is writing several decades later, do you think it is likely that he actually forgot who the other 2 were? Particularly if it was Andrew, Peter's brother and business partner. Business partner with him and James too. Is he likely to have forgotten that Andrew was one of those in the boat? Is he likely to have forgotten also that if Nathanael was there, that perhaps Philip was there too? Well, let's suppose then, hang on a minute, you might say, but this is all just conjecture. We don't know anything here. Well, let's take those 2 out of the equation. If you said then he could say for absolutely certain it wasn't Andrew and it wasn't Philip, he's down to a choice of 4 others. Do you really think, therefore, that he did not know who else was in that boat? Because I can't believe that, to be honest. Which leads me to think there must be a purpose in why he has named those that he has named and kept quiet and silent about those whose names are omitted. And as I look at those 3 that are named, I see that they all have something in common. All of them, in one way or another, either denied or doubted, deserted Jesus. They let Jesus down. If we go right back to the beginning, to chapter 1, The first one was Nathanael. Nathanael was sitting down one day, and his friend Philip comes rushing up to him and says, "Guess what, Nathanael? We have found the Messiah. And he's Jesus of Nazareth." Remember that Cana is just up the road from Nazareth. It's a little bit bigger town than Nazareth, and he would have known all about Nazareth. A little tiny village with nothing going for it. And his response is this: "Can anything good come from Nazareth? You've got to be kidding. The Messiah definitely has not come from Nazareth. There is nothing going to come out of Nazareth. It's a no-hope place." Of course, when Jesus did finally meet him, he shocked him by speaking into his life an insight that Jesus or a person could not possibly have known about, but Jesus did know. And then he believed and said, "Wow, you really are the Messiah. You really are the one who's sent from God. How did you possibly know about me in that particular situation under the tree?" Then, of course, there's Peter. Good old Peter. I mean, he's such a mix, isn't he, of enthusiasm and, he's so charged up and almost kind of a bit hyperactive, really. He goes headlong into things and then kind of thinks afterwards. And there are times when Peter has expressed incredible faith and incredible love for the Lord. And then there are those moments when you just wish that Peter had kept his mouth shut, that he hadn't done the things that he did. Aren't we all a bit like that sometimes? But of course, Peter was most well known in letting Jesus down through his denials of Jesus. John records them as well. And John records that just as Jesus said would happen, that there they are in the courtyard of the high priest's house. And actually, John records an interesting detail that nobody else records, that John was allowed in because he knew the high priest. And Peter had to be shut outside. So John apparently had a word with the high priest and said, "Excuse me, could I get my mate Peter to come in too? He's a good friend and he'd really like to be here." And so he has a word with the servant girl. I'm not quite sure what the servant girl's got to do. I presume that she was kind of unlocking and bolting the gate. And they let Peter in. So now Peter has been let in on the basis that he's John's friend. John knows the high priest. And John has now clearly shown that he is a follower of Jesus. And what does Peter do? As they unlock the gate and let him in, the girl says to him, "Aren't you one of Jesus' followers?" "No, not me." And then somebody else sees him as he's warming himself by the fire. "You were with Jesus, weren't you?" "No, not me." "You must have got it wrong, somebody else." And somebody else comes along a third time and says, "Yeah, no, you are one of Jesus' followers. I recognize you. In fact, I'm a relation of the man whose ear you cut off in the garden. I would never forget your face." "Really? No, definitely not me. It was not me. It might look like me, but it was not me. Definitely not me." At which point, the cock crows. One of the Gospels records that Jesus, at that point, looked straight at him. That must have been a piercing look. Peter let down Jesus badly. Then there's Thomas, the one who's so brave in chapter 11, says, "Let us go with him to Jerusalem." They had actually had to flee. There was trouble. And we're told that Jesus had left the populated areas. He'd gone to the other side of the Jordan, and he had gone to the place where John had been baptizing in the Jordan. Now, John was baptizing out in the desert. But when news reached Jesus that his friend Lazarus was sick, then Jesus went back. And it was Thomas who said, "Let us go with him." You saw the trouble last time he was there. You saw how they were picking up stones ready to stone him. They were so angry with him. They were going to kill him. Let us go. Let us die with him. And yet only a short while later, brave Thomas says, "I will never believe unless I see for myself the marks of those nails." The place where that spear pierced his side. Let me put my hand right into it. I want to physically touch it. Then and only then will I believe. And Jesus comes and he rebukes Thomas for his unbelief. I think in a sense he rebukes them all actually. Blessed are those who have not seen and believed, said Jesus. So all of these men let Jesus down in some way. And now it seems that John has named them. Naming and shaming, you might say. I'm not quite sure it's as severe as that. But what I do notice, and we kind of just slipped over into the next section of what happened after breakfast, because I want you to see that Jesus was then dealing with Peter. He had already dealt with Thomas. Thomas, when he doubted, Jesus spoke straight into Thomas's life. And he speaks to him and he says to him, "Come on then, you wanted to see these nail marks, you come and put your fingers here." And Thomas didn't need to do that. Thomas already confesses him and says, "My Lord and my God, I believe you. I don't need to do it," he says. But Jesus still hasn't dealt with Peter. He'd already dealt with Nathanael right at the beginning. He'd sorted that issue out. He'd sorted out the issue with Thomas. But Peter, he still had to sort out Peter's little wobble. And so Jesus says to Peter after breakfast, "Do you truly love me more than these? More than the rest of these disciples? Do you love me the most? Peter, when you realized that it was me, you jumped out of the boat. You swam to shore to come and greet me. Was that all show, Peter? Do you really love me? Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my sheep." And 3 times, just as Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, so 3 times Jesus asks Peter that very same question. And we call this the reinstating of Peter. But why did he need reinstating? Was it really that bad? He was under a lot of pressure, let's face it. Well, look, I want you to see here in this passage that we have things happening here that we cannot be absolutely sure what was in the hearts and the minds of those disciples on that night. But there is one thing that I think we can say, and we need to stick to the facts as we know them. The first fact is that John records the fact they went fishing. These are fishermen. Do you really record the fact that somebody goes fishing if they're a fisherman? If it's really of no significance whatsoever? How did it all happen? They're standing around and Peter says, "I'm going fishing," and they said, "We will go with you." And it's widely accepted that he's not just saying here It's that time of the evening. The sun's going down. It's time we got in that boat and went out and earned a crust. He's not saying that. He seems to be showing that even though they had seen Jesus at least twice, that they have now gone back home, back to the old way of life, back to what they know best, back to the securities that they had before, back to life as it was before Jesus. They've gone back. And Peter has gone back to fishing. And he's gone out there to earn a living. But you see, it was Jesus who said to Peter, "Follow me. Follow me. I will make you fishers of men," as we say. You will catch men from now on. Leave that business. And just apart from the odd occasional time when Peter was out in the boats, I guess, when they were in Galilee at a loose end and going out and doing a bit of fishing, doing what they did best, over those next 2.5, 3 years, I mean, being with Jesus, they've been going all around the country, sometimes in the south in Jerusalem and Judea, sometimes in the middle in Samaritan country, sometimes walking around the towns and the villages of Galilee away from the sea itself, sometimes across the other side of Galilee in what they call the Decapolis, the 10 cities. Sometimes they were out on their own going preaching and teaching people. They weren't fishing. But now they'd gone back. And I think all of them had gone back. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if they were all fishermen. And this was the case of saying, well, we could hang around here waiting forever. We don't know what Jesus is going to do. Let's put faith in our own work, our own securities. And so back they go. But it was a mistake. And we know it's a mistake because the first thing is, quite surprisingly, these experienced fishermen spend a whole night fishing and at the end of it catch absolutely nothing. That's not the first time that has happened. It's not the first time that Jesus has appeared and a miraculous catch has happened. It's the first time John records it, but it's not the first time it's happened. Luke records one in his gospel too, where they catch an enormous catch of fish towards the beginning of Jesus' ministry. In fact, just as he was calling those disciples, and Peter was profoundly affected on that occasion, and he threw himself at Jesus' feet, saying, "My Lord and my God, go away from me. I am only a man, and you are clearly God. I'm a sinner. Keep away from me. I'm unholy." That was his calling. And this has echoes of what happened that first time round. Apart from this time, Peter has turned his back on the Lord. He's walked away. He's gone back to what he knew best. He's out there throwing his net out, and probably a cast net. There was one boat, it seems. So they take the cast net. It's a big round net. You throw it out. It has weights on it. It kind of sinks down into the water like a great big balloon. And then you pull some drawstrings at the bottom, closes the net up, and they drag it in. The cast net. They've been out with their cast net all night long, and it was unusual to catch nothing. And just as previously, when Jesus had said to them, "Cast your net into the water," in the middle of the day, and Peter, who'd spent all night fishing and caught nothing, and now had all his fishing friends sitting on the shore watching him, who know very well that you never fish in the middle of the day. The fish are not going to be fooled by that. But he says, "Because you say so, I will let down the nets." And on this occasion, Jesus does the same thing. This time he calls out to them and he says, "Put your net on the other side of the boat, the side where you never put it, because it will get tied up in the rudder." And as he puts the net down, So this huge catch of fish comes in. And then they recognize the Lord. And you see, I think there is a lesson here when we're looking at the whole idea of coming from fear to faith, which is what we were looking at last week, and this is what we're continuing with here. That this gradual process of coming back to faith again, they had had their faith knocked so much that it was taking not just one appearance of Jesus, not two, but at least 3 appearances of Jesus. It was taking a number of weeks. It was taking them time to just take in what was happening, what Jesus had been saying, the teaching that he'd given to them, the realization of the whole thing, that actually God was bringing his plan about. That's what's happening. And yet still they were prepared to go backwards. But when we go from fear to faith, yes, we'll still go through those moments. Sometimes it's a little bit like that with our faith. It's a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. That's how faith works. So we mustn't beat ourselves up too much when we find that our faith is not as strong as perhaps we might like it to be. That's what being human is all about. But on the other hand, we do want to move to that point of faith. We don't want to live as fearful people. We want to live as people of faith. And just as Jesus was dealing with this particular situation, and in particular to take hold of Peter and show him, Peter, I've got much better things for you. Just as I called you out of fishing, notice now that you can't catch anything without me. When Jesus was there, when Jesus instructed, then their fishing was successful. 153 large fish. Having eaten those fish, not all of them, I hasten to add, I'm sure they didn't eat them all, but eaten some of those fish, and the fact that Jesus was already there on the shore with the fish cooking. And they were surprised at that too. But Jesus is just showing them, he's saying, you see, I am more powerful than you are. My word is stronger than your words. My actions are stronger than your actions. That you wanted to go back fishing, Peter, and indeed all the rest of you, remember, I called you out of this. I called you to something higher. I called you to catch people. Come out of fishing and go and feed the sheep. That's what I called you to do. Feed the sheep. Jesus doesn't have fish, he only has sheep. If you're going to look after my business, you tend to the sheep. It's interesting how John's gospel finishes off. Because as we come to the end of it, it almost kind of leaves a cliffhanger. We read a couple of those instances of where Jesus is reinstating Peter. But I want you to look now, we read up as far as verse 16. I just want to read a little bit further from verse 17. The third time he said to Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were younger and you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Wonder where they're going. Wonder where Jesus is off to. They're sitting around a beach barbecue. Where now are they off to? It seems that they were literally walking somewhere, away from the beach, away from the boat, away from the fish. away from the water, because Peter turned around and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. So they are physically walking somewhere. John identifies himself as that man in the next section. But verse 21, when Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? What is it to you, Jesus said? If he survives until I come back. But having said that, and a rumour started that John would of course remain until Jesus came back. But having said that, Peter, by the time John is writing, is clearly dead. But where on earth was Jesus going? We're not told. He doesn't tell us, because he's just saying, not follow me into town. He's not following me out of town. He's not following me up to the mountain of the ascension. He's just saying, follow me. When I call you, I meant you to follow me. I didn't expect you to turn back. Follow me. And that's the message, I think, that is still there for us today. That Jesus, when he calls us and he says, follow me, he doesn't expect us to turn back. Sometimes he has to deal with the problems that we have. Sometimes the areas of disobedience, the times when we've let him down, the times when we may have found ourselves either disowning, denying Jesus, dishonouring him, or whatever. And sometimes he will have to take us to task over those things. And he does confront us, I believe, to this day, and says, what was all that about? But in his grace, he also restores us if we truly are following him. And his grace is so great that he will reinstate us too, even when we've let him down. And what I want you to take away from this is, as we move from the fear to the faith, just as they did, that actually it is about believing, it's about trusting, and even when you're waiting around and thinking, where is the Lord? Maybe that's what they were doing, kicking their heels and saying, well, Jesus hasn't shown up again. He came a few weeks ago and now we haven't seen him. Perhaps he's not coming back. Perhaps there is nothing else. But if that's how it feels in our lives, remember, just follow me. Stick to the instructions that I gave you, and all will be revealed. I sense that sometimes some of us in our lives feel that actually we want to give up the following. We just want to do our own thing. We no longer care really about where God wants me to be. And that's definitely a dangerous place to be. If Jesus has said to you, follow me, make sure that you follow him, no matter what, no matter where he goes.